Hey folks, I want to talk about this one tweet that I don't know how to pronounce his name, Kalajian, retweeted. Everybody knows about he's a troll, and he tweeted this tweet that says, "You total plonker, Dr. Neil Barnard," and it's this study where they compared a conventional diet to a vegan diet for the treatment of diabetes. And I'm going to explain why this tweet doesn't make any sense. I'm not a fan of Dr. Barnard. I complain vociferously to my vegan friends who know Dr. Barnard, and they tell me he's the greatest, at least he's the kindest, gentlest guy, very nice, very good guy. I believe all of that, but I don't think that as a public nutrition expert, he does a great job. He oversteps the evidence in promoting a vegan diet. Nonetheless, even though all of that's true, the criticism that has been made here is entirely illegitimate. The reason I want to make a video, though, is because this is an incredibly common criticism of diet studies, which is that this diet study said X, but I saw in my own personal anecdote Y, therefore the diet study is nonsense, or therefore the diet study is shows an effect that's not as good as whatever anecdotal or case study or this or that I have to show. So that's an illegitimate criticism of a study, so I'm going to explain why. This study shows a graph of HbA1c. It's from 6.5 to 8.5 on the y-axis. 6.5 is a diabetic HbA1c. HbA1c basically just looks at the glycated hemoglobin of red blood cells. Since red blood cells are constantly exposed to the bloodstream, everything else, all the metabolites in the bloodstream, everything that goes through the body's systemic circulation, since red cells are constantly exposed to that environment, the glycation of the red blood cells reflects the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. So the glucose molecules will bind to the red blood cells and cause it to become glycated. The degree to which it's glycated, the degree to which glucose molecules have glycated the red blood cells, is a direct reflection of the blood glucose levels over the past 90 to 100 days. And the reason 120 days, and the reason this is the case is that red blood cells last about 90 to 120 days. So you can calculate based on how much glycation you have of red blood cells what the average blood glucose was. So if you have really high peaks in blood glucose after a meal, you have that on a regular basis, you could see that in the glycated hemoglobin. Well, glycated hemoglobin above 6.5 is diabetic. You really want to get it below about 6, and that's because even though the cutoff for diabetes is 6.5, that's somewhat arbitrary and was based on an arbitrary cutoff. There are complications, many disease processes, including stroke and myocardial infarction, that is to say heart attack, you start to have a high risk of those particular diseases at a lower hemoglobin than 6.5, maybe even as low as 6, or maybe even slightly lower than that. So 6.5 is the cutoff for diabetes, but really the higher risk of death starts substantially lower than 6.5. Nonetheless, in this particular study, they saw in the vegan group maybe a 0.5 difference in HbA1c hemoglobin. That's not a large difference. It's very modest and very mild. Whereas this guy, David Wyant, called him a total plonker, I'm assuming that's a Britishism, saw a decrease from 10.3, which is an extraordinarily high HbA1c, to 5.3, which is an incredible and dramatic decrease in HbA1c down to the normal range. And that is wonderful. It's amazing that he did that. I have all the greatest respect for David White, and I think that is an amazing outcome. Congratulations to him. Nonetheless, it's not the way to criticize a study, and I'm going to explain why. The results in the Barnard study represent the intervention group average under certain trial conditions. Certain people that surround the trial participants, certain social support, certain ways that the dietary intervention was administered, like how often they met dietitians, etc., etc. The anecdote from David Wyant, on the other hand, represents a single person's experience under what could be entirely different conditions. So He could have somebody rah-rahing him every single morning that he wakes up. He could have a whole team of dietitians around him. He could have direct contact with a great low-carb guru, etc., etc. All of these things could be true, and so that would make his situation entirely different from the trial participants. And actually, we don't know what the actual truth of that is because that information isn't provided for by David Wyant. Nonetheless, Bernard's study is not incompatible with tremendous and extraordinary. Hold on a second, I'm going to close the door. Bernard's study is not incompatible with a tremendous decrease in HbA1c, the same level that was seen by Wyant. And the reason for that is that we don't actually know what the individual participant drops in HbA1c, where we only know the average, and the average effect is substantially less than the effect at the extremes. So it's possible even that Bernard's intervention is more effective than a low carbohydrate diet as seen by as used by David Wyant. We actually don't know that because all we see is David Wyant's data points. We don't actually see what the average data points are. So David Wyant could actually be an extreme. It could be an outlier. We don't know because all we have is an anecdote, and most likely he's an outlier. And the reason he's most likely an outlier is because outliers are going to be more common, or they're going to have a higher tendency and they're going to more frequently report their results than the people who get modest or meager results from a dietary intervention. They're going to be more likely to evangelize. So almost certainly he's an outlier. And especially since given his extreme response. We know he's an outlier because we know he's an outlier because no diet study has ever shown such an extreme change in HbA1c on average. So he's certainly an outlier in any diabetes study at all. Or any large diabetes study, I'll say. I don't know of every single diabetes study that's ever been done that's in a randomized controlled trial format. So there could be some diabetes trials that show such a large effect, but no large ones do, which is to say no ones that contain a large amount of participants and are not subject to large amounts of error due to chance effects. So Bernard's study is not incompatible with that, with people like David Wyant. And then without more information, we don't actually know any of these things. I'm just pointing out that we actually don't know a whole lot based upon just David Wyant's anecdote. And we don't know a whole lot even about the extreme cases in Bernard's study. As an aside, I do think that a low carbohydrate diet can play an important role in treating type 2 diabetes. I also think a high carbohydrate can effectively treat type 2 diabetes. And this is because of Roy Taylor's twin cycles of diabetes hypothesis. And even Jason Fung cites Roy Taylor very disingenuously, but he does cite Roy Taylor. Roy Taylor basically pointed out that whenever people lose weight on any kind of diet, they'll lose, of course some diets will promote weight loss more than others, but on any kind of diet, if people lose weight, they will lose weight from their pancreas and their liver, and this correlates and associates very strongly with remission of diabetes, an increase in insulin sensitivity, and lower HbA1c, and many experiments have demonstrated that this effect is probably causal. So current evidence suggests that the weight loss is the main factor in type 2 diabetes treatment. Nonetheless, low carbohydrate or carbohydrate restriction can produce immediate gains in glycemic control that are not obtainable on a high carbohydrate diet. And this is just because when you reduce the amount of carbohydrate that you're taking in, you're going to get less of a response in glucose in the bloodstream. This is just how physiology works. So this would make carbohydrate restriction a desirable treatment modality in patients who cannot permanently lose adequate weight to reverse the underlying metabolic dysfunction. So people who can't lose enough weight, can't reverse their liver fat, can't reverse their pancreatic fat, just by restricting diabetes by itself, they can see a substantial decrease in glycemia and probably an improvement in metabolic function. And there's many studies that suggest that there is a causal relationship between high blood glucose levels and disease risk. So decreasing your blood glucose levels might conceivably decrease your disease risk overall, although we don't know that for sure because fatty acids also increase and they are also associated with disease risk. However, I believe the weight of evidence points towards wanting higher levels of fatty acids versus wanting higher levels of glucose. And of course, as I should point out that you're going to get higher levels of fatty acids on a low carbohydrate diet, assuming you're not losing weight, because you have to replace carbohydrate with fat. And so for that reason, you are going to get those higher levels of fatty acids. But the net sum of evidence points to that being less harmful than glucose. And that's what I would do if I was treating a person who could not lose weight. I would use a low carbohydrate diet, and I would also use drugs if needed. Okay, so, and which is what the Virtus study did, by the way. Virtus study did exactly that. The study that everybody who's in the low carbohydrate community goes rah, rah, rah about. They used low carbohydrate diet plus drugs to maintain euglycemia, that is to say, normal blood glucose levels. Nonetheless, low and high carbohydrate diets don't produce any difference in weight loss and free living conditions. We've seen that again and again and again. DietFits is a great example of that. But meta-analyses of studies that have been conducted for greater 12 months show that we do not get greater weight loss in higher low carbohydrate diets. So a high versus a low carbohydrate or a low versus a high carbohydrate diet will not produce a superior outcome in terms of reversing the metabolic dysfunction. Therefore, in this respect, they're essentially equivalent. So back to the scientific problems. These extreme anecdotes lend toward their being overreported. I just pointed that out earlier. That's why we hear about them instead of failures. We don't often hear about diet failures because people are embarrassed about diet failures. Often they'll even blame themselves. This makes testimonials of people who follow diet gurus look so much more impressive than most trial results. So many trial results, you're going to get modest outcomes, the majority of them, whereas perhaps almost any intervention you can think of, you're going to get an enormous, there's going to be some people who can show an enormous and dramatic improvement in their symptoms or disease with almost any intervention, no matter how ineffective it is in the trials. And that's just because you're going to get over-reporting of outliers. This is why case studies are not regarded as acceptable scientific evidence for an intervention, because they could be highly selective and unusual. In fact, this is why small trials are regarded with the same skepticism. There's a well-known pattern in the Alzheimer's literature, and I was taught this by one of my former mentors. You often get these highly successful case studies or small trials, and then you test it in real life, and then you get a larger failed clinical trial. So a great example of this is ketones. So with ketones, you have these amazing results with Mary Newport. You have, and then you have much larger trials that showed no benefit for MCTs. You do have plausible reasons for thinking ketones might actually help Alzheimer's. They can replace the fuel, and because neurons take up ketones more readily than they do in blood glucose in many Alzheimer's patients, then perhaps you might be able to feel the neurons to a better degree than you would be able to feel them if you were just giving a high glucose diet. There's still plausibility to this, and they haven't tested really high levels of blood ketones for Alzheimer's disease yet. And they haven't tested it in a rigorous way that would be convincing. So it could be the case that ketones could treat Alzheimer's disease. Nonetheless, in small trials, case studies, they did these things. They didn't see the same effects in the large trials. And that's not just ketones. We're talking a lot of different drugs, tau inhibitors, and a lot of other drugs that showed really promising effects in small trials. It's a very, very common pattern. The cynics among people sometimes say that the reason this is because small trials are easier to manipulate, and then you can keep the grant money going on for another 5 years and keep going until you find something else. And so that's why people tend to find these results in smaller trials more often. Another explanation might be that smaller trials, there's just a greater chance that noise can overcome the signal, and it can look like, or the lack of signal, I should say. So it can look like there's a signal when there isn't really one there, because you just don't have enough participants, and this can be distorting to your outcome. So you can see a signal when it's not really there because the trial can just get skewed because there's such a small number of participants. So for example, just by chance, I could be taking a tau inhibitor, and because of some weird properties in my disease process, or because on the day of testing I was just in a real bad state, so I had particularly bad Alzheimer's symptoms that day, Then, say it 20 days later, me and 11 other guys, they had a similar situation where they just had a bad day by chance. And since it's only 11 people that can happen, and we only need a certain number of people, like 5 or 6, to happen. And then we all saw this big improvement in Alzheimer's symptoms. And it has nothing to do with the tau inhibitor, but it's just because by chance, and we have such a small number of people, we saw a big effect that actually isn't real. This happens all the time. And confounders like that of just being in the right place at the right time, things reversing just by chance. For example, David Wyant could perhaps be in a situation where he suddenly had a life change in living conditions, where he moved to a new area. He moved out of the influence of a lot of friends who ate junk food all the time, and he got married to some health nut who taught him to eat low carb and really beat him over the head about it. And so all those things could be confounding his results and really causing his diet to look a lot better than it actually would be. But we don't know, because we don't actually have the report, and we don't have that level of control that we would need in order to determine that. So basically, this person's anecdote amounts to a case study. We don't trust case studies for medicine. We don't base treatment modalities on cases unless there's just a really small number of people and it's a really rare disease. But when there's a large number of people and then there's a large number of people with the disease, we don't base on case studies. We base it on randomized controlled trials for exactly these reasons. And so these anecdotes, like from David Weiner, are only compelling if one believes that their representativeness of the efficacy itself has already been shown. But this is not the case. To my awareness, low versus high carbohydrate diabetes reversal trials have never been conducted. So you can't actually compare an anecdote to what happens to an RCT for exactly all the reasons I've been talking about. You don't have enough control in the anecdote, and all these chance factors can distort the effects, and you can also just report outliers. So I don't think that a vegan diet in itself is a good idea for treating diabetes, and I do think that Bernard's results are rather unimpressive, and they show the inadequacy of his specific intervention for treating the disease. However, so it's not good. So however, it's just not a great trial. However, the use of an anecdote to criticize the study is just plain silly. An anecdote cannot be used to criticize a large trial. End of story. Cannot be used to criticize a large trial. That people seems to think that an anecdote can oppose a randomized controlled trial shows that people don't really understand what science is or how it works. Basically, science is just a rigorous, systematic way of understanding reality, and using an anecdote to oppose science is an unsystematic and unrigorous way of understanding reality. So you can't use an anecdote to contrast with or criticize a study. And I hope what I've said makes sense and persuades some people that that's the case. If you have any questions, you can message me or send me a tweet on Twitter. I'm at Kevin in Bass. That's Kevin in. So there's 2 N's, BASS. I'll talk to you guys later.